Grand Admiral Vorath Zane stood on the command bridge of his flagship, the Throne of Silence, and looked out at the largest war fleet assembled in 600 years. 9,700 warships stretched across the darkness of space like a river of steel and fire, each one carrying enough power to burn a continent to ash. He was tall for a Cathari, with gray skin pulled tight over sharp bones, and 4 eyes that never blinked. His species had ruled this part of the galaxy for 12,000 years, and in all that time they had never once lost a war. Not once, not ever. The reason was simple. The Cathari did not fight fair, and they did not fight small. When they found a rising species, a young civilization growing too fast and reaching too far, they sent a purge fleet to end it before it could become a threat. It was clean, it was efficient, and it had worked every single time. Today the target was a small blue planet called Earth, tucked away in an unremarkable corner of the Milky Way. Its people called themselves humans, and Cathari scouts had been watching them for decades. The reports were troubling. These creatures had gone from horse-drawn carts to nuclear weapons in barely 2 centuries, and their rate of technological growth was unlike anything the Cathari had ever recorded. Vorath turned to face his war council. 12 senior officers sat around the curved table, their 4 eyes fixed on the holographic display showing the Sol system. Earth glowed blue and green at the center, so small, so fragile, so utterly unaware of what was coming. The humans have colonized their moon and their 4th planet, Sub-Admiral Kireth reported, her voice flat and calm. They possess roughly 300 combat-capable ships, orbital defense platforms, and ground-based weapons systems. By our standards, they are primitive. Then why are we sending 9,700 ships? Asked Commander Draith from the far end of the table. He was young and had never seen a purge before. Surely a fraction of this fleet would be enough, he added. Vorath did not look at him. Instead, he let the silence stretch, long and heavy, until every officer in the room felt the weight of it. Then he spoke, and his voice was like stone dragging across metal. Overkill is a myth, he said. There is only kill, and there is failure. We do not fail. We have never failed, and we will not begin failing today because some junior officer thought we were being wasteful. Draith lowered his eyes and said nothing more. Kireth pulled up the fleet deployment plan. The 9,700 ships would enter the Sol system near Jupiter, form a standard annihilation pattern, and advance toward Earth in 3 waves. The first wave would destroy the human fleet. The second would eliminate orbital defenses. The third would bombard the planet until nothing remained but dust and silence. It was the same plan the Cathari had used against the Voreen, the Malthuri, the Gesic, and dozens of other species that had shown too much promise. All of them were gone now, their cities reduced to craters, their cultures erased from history, their names remembered only in Cathari military archives. How long until we reach the Sol system? Vorath asked. 14 standard hours, Kireth replied. Good, he said, and he clasped his hands behind his back. Begin final preparations. I want every ship battle-ready before we drop out of hyperspace. The officers stood, saluted with fists pressed to chests, and filed out of the room. Only Kireth remained. She lingered by the door, her expression unreadable. You have something to say, Vorath said without turning around. The Galactic Council has sent another formal objection, she said. 7 species have condemned this operation. They say the humans have done nothing to warrant a purge. They breathe, Vorath replied. They grow, they build, they reach for the stars. That is enough. It has always been enough. Kireth nodded once and left the bridge. Vorath stood alone in the dim light of 1,000 holographic displays, watching the stars slide past as the fleet hurtled through hyperspace. Somewhere ahead, on a tiny blue world, 8 billion humans went about their lives. eating, sleeping, laughing, arguing, building, dreaming, completely unaware that the most powerful military force in the galaxy was coming to erase them from existence. He felt nothing about this. He had done it before, and he would do it again. It was not cruelty. It was simply the way the galaxy worked. Meanwhile, 400 light-years away, a woman named Lena Vasquez sat in a dark room beneath the Rocky Mountains and stared at a screen that was showing her the end of the world. She was the director of the United Earth Defense Directorate, and she had held the position for 11 years. She was 53, with sharp dark eyes and silver-streaked hair pulled back in a tight knot. She had spent her entire career preparing for threats that most people believed would never come. Now the threat was here, and it was worse than anything she had ever imagined. The deep space sensor array near Neptune had detected them first, thousands of energy signatures pouring into the outer solar system like a flood. The numbers kept climbing. 3,000, 5,000, 7,000, 9,000. When the count passed 9,700, the technicians had stopped counting and started praying. Vasquez did not pray. She picked up the phone and called every military commander on Earth, on the Moon, and on Mars. Within 30 minutes, she was sitting in a bunker with the most powerful people in human civilization, and every single one of them looked terrified. "We cannot fight this," said General Morrison of the European Defense Coalition, his face pale under the harsh bunker lights. "We have 300 ships. They have nearly 10,000. The math is impossible." "Surrender might be our only option," whispered the Chinese premier, his voice barely audible. "Negotiation," suggested the Secretary General of the United Nations. "We should attempt to communicate and find a peaceful resolution." Vasquez listened to all of them. She let them speak, let them argue, let them panic. And when the room finally fell silent, when every eye turned to her, she leaned forward in her chair and spoke in a voice that was quiet but absolutely firm. "They crossed 400 light-years of space with 10,000 warships," she said. "They did not come to talk." The room went cold. "Then what do we do?" Morrison asked. Vasquez reached into her briefcase and pulled out a black folder with red lettering stamped across the front. "Operation Pale Horse, Extinction Level Response Protocol." She placed it on the table and opened it. 20 years ago, a team of strategists, scientists, and military planners was given one question. What do we do if something comes to kill us all, and it is bigger and stronger than anything we can match? She said. This is the answer they came up with. It is not a plan for victory in the traditional sense. It is a plan for making the enemy pay such a terrible price that victory becomes meaningless to them. She looked around the room, meeting every pair of eyes. We cannot match their firepower. We cannot match their numbers. We cannot match their technology. But we can do something they have never seen before. We can make them bleed, and we can make them afraid, and we can turn every single one of our weaknesses into a weapon they do not expect. The room was silent. Then, one by one, the leaders of Earth nodded. Vasquez stood and walked to the main display. She pulled up the Pale Horse battle plan, and the screen filled with tactical overlays, deployment schedules, and contingency trees. It was the most complex military operation in human history, and it started with something that seemed like madness. Our 300 ships will launch immediately, she said. Their mission is not to win. Their mission is not even to survive. Their mission is to engage the enemy, collect every piece of data they can about alien weapons, shields, and formations, and transmit that data back to Earth before they are destroyed. You are sending them to die, Morrison said. I am sending them to fight, Vasquez replied, and their sacrifice will give us what we need to turn this entire solar system into a graveyard. Not for us, but for them. She paused and looked out at the room one final time. They want to erase us. They think we are small and weak and easy to kill. They are about to learn what happens when you corner 8 billion people with nothing left to lose. And somewhere deep in the cold silence of space, 9,700 alien warships raced toward Earth, carrying fire and death, and the absolute certainty that this would be easy. They had no idea what was waiting for them. The first Cathari ships dropped out of hyperspace near Jupiter, and the darkness of space suddenly burned with light. 9,700 warships materialized in a formation so vast it could be seen from Saturn. A wall of metal and energy that stretched across millions of kilometers, bristling with weapons that could crack moons and boil oceans. Grand Admiral Vorath Zane stood on the bridge of the Throne of Silence and watched the holographic display as his fleet settled into position. Everything was exactly as planned. The ships moved with mechanical precision, each one sliding into its assigned coordinates without error. This was the Cathari way: order, discipline, and overwhelming force. "Broadcast the standard message," Vorath ordered. Sub-Admiral Kirith nodded and activated the transmission array. A signal shot toward Earth at the speed of light, translated into every human language the Cathari had catalogued. The message was simple, cold, and final. Your species has been assessed and scheduled for removal. Resistance is noted, but irrelevant. They waited for a response. The Cathari always gave the target species a chance to respond, not out of mercy, but because the recordings were useful for psychological studies. Most species begged, some threatened, a few simply wept. But from Earth, there came nothing. No words, no pleas, no threats, no surrender. Just silence, vast and absolute. Kirith frowned and ran a diagnostic on the communications array. "The signal was received," she confirmed. "They heard us, they simply chose not to answer." Vorath tilted his head slightly. In 12,000 years of purges, this had happened only twice before. And both times, the silent species had already been dead when the fleet arrived, killed by their own internal wars. But the Cathari sensors showed 8 billion life signs on Earth. The humans were very much alive. They had simply chosen silence. "Interesting," Vorath murmured. Then he shrugged and gave the order to advance. The armada began to move. 9,700 ships surged forward like a tide of iron, crossing the distance between Jupiter and the inner solar system at speeds that bent light itself. Ahead of them, Earth's 300 warships had already launched, and Cathari sensors tracked them spreading out across the void in a pattern that made absolutely no tactical sense. Commander Drafe studied the human formation from his station, and shook his head. "They are not forming a defensive line," he said. "They are spreading thin, almost randomly. There is no concentration of force, no fallback position, no reserve. This is not a battle formation, this is chaos." "Perhaps they are simply panicking," another officer suggested. But Kirith said nothing. She watched the human ships scatter across the black, and felt something she could not name, a faint itch at the base of her skull, the kind of feeling she got when something was wrong, but she could not yet see it. The two forces met near the orbit of Mars, and the killing began. Cathari plasma lances cut through the void like burning swords, and the first human ships exploded in blossoms of fire and debris. The human vessels were small, barely a fraction of the size of a Cathari cruiser, and their shields were laughably weak by galactic standards. Each Cathari volley destroyed 3 or 4 of them. Captain Reo Tanaka stood on the bridge of the destroyer Iron Wake and watched the ships around him die. The Cathari fire was relentless, great beams of superheated energy that turned steel into vapor in less than a second. His tactical display was a graveyard of red markers, each one a ship that had been there moments ago and was now nothing but expanding gas. His orders from Director Vasquez were carved into his mind like words in stone. Engage at close range, draw their fire, transmit everything you see, and hold the line as long as you can. She had not said, survive. She had not said, retreat. She had not even said, win. She had said, "Hold the line," and Tanaka understood what that meant. "All ships, push forward," he ordered into the fleet channel. "Get close. Get inside their formations. Make them shoot at us from every angle. I want our sensors touching their hulls." The human fleet surged forward, not away from the Cathari weapons, but directly into them. It was insane by any military standard. 61 ships died in the first hour alone, torn apart by weapons they could barely comprehend. But every ship that died was transmitting. Every sensor was recording. Every explosion was data. The human ships measured the exact frequency of Cathari plasma weapons. They mapped the energy curves of alien shields. They cataloged the communication signals between enemy vessels and identified the command hierarchy. They tracked formation patterns, response times, and the tiny gaps between shield rotations that lasted only fractions of a second. And all of this was beamed back to Earth at the speed of light, pouring into the computers buried beneath the Rocky Mountains where Vasquez and her team were watching. Some of the human captains did something the Cathari had never seen before. When their ships were crippled and burning, instead of drifting dead in space, they aimed their wrecks at Cathari vessels and accelerated. 3 human destroyers rammed directly into a Cathari cruiser, and the combined explosion tore the alien ship in half. Others detonated their reactors at point-blank range, turning themselves into nuclear fireballs that engulfed nearby enemy ships in walls of radiation and shrapnel. The Cathari shields held against most of these attacks, but not all of them. 14 Cathari ships were destroyed. On any other day, in any other context, 14 ships out of 9,700 would be meaningless, a rounding error, a statistical nothing. But Sub-Admiral Kirith stared at the number on her display and felt the itch in her skull grow stronger. No purge target had destroyed a Cathari warship in over 2,000 years. And now, in the first hour of engagement, a species that did not even have faster-than-light travel had killed 14. "Grand Admiral," she said carefully, stepping closer to Vorath, "the humans are not fighting to win this engagement." "Obviously," he replied, his 4 eyes fixed on the tactical display. "They are dying." "Yes," Kirith agreed, "but they are dying in a very specific way. Every ship that engages us is transmitting massive amounts of data back to their homeworld. They are scanning our weapons, our shields, our formations. They are learning everything about us." She paused, choosing her next words with great care. "They are not fighting to win," she said again. "They are fighting to learn." Vorath was quiet for a moment. Then he made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Let them learn," he said. "What will they do with the knowledge? Build better ships in the next 3 hours? They are a doomed species, watching their own extinction. If recording the process gives them comfort, so be it." Kirith nodded and returned to her station, but the itch did not go away. She had studied many species before their destruction, and she had seen all kinds of last stands. Desperate charges, hopeless defenses, tearful surrenders. But she had never seen a species sacrifice its own soldiers as instruments of reconnaissance. She had never seen a people die on purpose. The battle raged for 6 more hours. The human fleet was shattered. Only 84 ships remained out of 300, and most of those were damaged beyond effective combat capability. The space between Mars and Earth was filled with wreckage, frozen bodies, and the fading heat signatures of dead reactors. But the transmission logs showed that every single human ship had successfully sent its data back to Earth before being destroyed. Every single one. Back in the bunker beneath the Rocky Mountains, Director Vasquez stood before a wall of screens showing the most complete technical analysis of an alien military force ever assembled by human hands. She knew the frequency of every Cathari weapon. She knew the rotation cycle of every shield type. She knew the communication protocols, the command structure, the response times, and the blind spots. Her people had paid for this knowledge with their blood, and she would not waste a single drop of it. An aide approached, his face gray with grief. "Director, We lost 216 ships, over 40,000 crew. Captain Tanaka and the Iron Wake are still active, but heavily damaged. Vasquez looked at the data flowing across her screens. The shield harmonics, the weapon frequencies, the tiny vulnerabilities hidden in the Cathari armor. Her people had found them. Her people had died to find them. Now we know how they bleed, she said quietly. She turned to her command staff and activated the next phase of Operation Pale Horse. Begin conversion of all orbital assets, she ordered. Every satellite, every station, every piece of hardware in orbit, I wanted weaponized within 24 hours. Activate the lunar mass drivers, arm the submarine nuclear fleet for orbital delivery, and deploy the locust swarms. All of them? Her aide asked. Every single one, Vasquez replied. They think the battle is over. They think they won the hard part. But that was just the introduction. She looked at the screens one last time, at the 84 surviving ships, still fighting, still transmitting, still refusing to die. The Cathari fleet advanced toward Earth with the confidence of a species that had never known defeat. Grand Admiral Vorath ordered his ships into standard orbital bombardment formation, a massive ring that would encircle the planet and rain fire from every angle until nothing was left alive. It was the same formation the Cathari had used to kill worlds for 12,000 years, and it had never failed. But as the first ships crossed into near-Earth space, something strange happened. The tactical display began to flash with warning signals, hundreds of them, then thousands, then so many that the screen could barely keep up. "What is this?" Vorath demanded. Sub-Admiral Kirith was already pulling up sensor data, and what she saw made her 4 eyes widen. "The humans have turned their entire orbital space into a minefield," she reported, her voice tight with disbelief. "Every satellite in their orbit has been modified. Communication satellites have been loaded with kinetic warheads. Weather monitoring platforms are carrying electromagnetic pulse charges. Navigation arrays have been fragmented into clouds of sensor-blinding debris. That is their civilian infrastructure," Commander Draith said. "They are destroying their own technology to use it as weapons." "Not destroying," Kirith corrected. "Repurposing. Every single object in their orbit has been turned into a weapon in the last 48 hours. All of it." The first wave of converted satellites struck the lead Cathari ships like a storm of metal and fire. Communication satellites, small, insignificant things that the Cathari would normally ignore, slammed into warships at orbital velocity, punching through outer hull plating and detonating their makeshift warheads inside. Weather platforms exploded in bursts of electromagnetic energy that scrambled sensors and knocked targeting systems offline. Clouds of shattered metal filled the space around the fleet, grinding against shields and clogging intake vents. 22 Cathari ships were damaged in the first minutes. 6 were destroyed outright. Vorath gripped the railing of his command platform. This was not supposed to happen. Orbital debris was a nuisance, not a weapon. No species had ever thought to weaponize its own civilian satellites. It was like tearing down your own house to build a wall of bricks and broken glass. But the humans were not finished, not even close. From the surface of the moon, the massive electromagnetic rail drivers that humanity had built for asteroid mining roared to life. But instead of launching mining capsules, they hurled thousands of tons of raw rock, chunks of lunar stone, and captured asteroid material. Each piece the size of a building, on precisely calculated trajectories aimed at the heart of the Cathari fleet. It was a shotgun blast of stone, fired across the void at incredible speed. The rocks had no engines, no guidance systems, no technology at all. They were just mass. Raw, stupid, brutal mass, and there were thousands of them. Cathari shields were designed to stop energy weapons, plasma lances, particle beams, nuclear detonations. They were brilliant against sophisticated attacks. But 1,000,000 tons of dumb rock slamming into shields at 20 kilometers per second was something no Cathari engineer had ever planned for. The shields held against individual impacts, but the sheer volume was staggering. Ship after ship found its shields drained by the constant barrage, leaving them vulnerable to what came next. From the oceans of Earth, submarines launched hundreds of nuclear missiles on ballistic arcs that carried them into orbit. These were not aimed at specific ships. The humans knew their targeting systems were not precise enough for that. Instead, the warheads detonated in clusters throughout the Cathari formation, creating massive electromagnetic pulses that washed over the fleet in waves of invisible fire. The EMPs did not destroy ships, but they blinded them. Sensor arrays flickered and died. Targeting computers crashed and rebooted. Communication links between ships dissolved into static. For precious minutes at a time, individual Cathari ships were cut off from the fleet, unable to see the enemy, unable to coordinate with their allies, unable to do anything except drift and wait for their systems to recover. And it was in those minutes of blindness that the locusts came. Director Vasquez had saved the locust swarms for exactly this moment. They were small autonomous drones, each one no bigger than a football, originally designed for asteroid mining demolition. Each drone carried a single-shaped explosive charge, a simple sensor package, and a tiny thruster. They were cheap, they were crude, and they were almost laughably primitive by galactic standards. But there were millions of them. They poured out of orbital launchers, cargo bays of surviving human ships, and even modified civilian aircraft that had climbed to the edge of space just to release their payloads. A swarm of 4 million drones descended on the Cathari fleet like a plague of metal insects. The drones were programmed with the data that the sacrificial fleet had collected in the first battle. The shield rotation cycles, the armor weak points, the tiny gaps in Cathari defenses that lasted only fractions of a second. Each drone found its target, waited for the precise moment when a shield flickered or an armor plate shifted, and then drove itself into the gap and detonated. One drone could not destroy a Cathari warship. 10 drones could not destroy a Cathari warship. But 100 drones, each one hitting a different weak point in rapid succession, could crack open a battle cruiser like an egg. The Cathari fleet began to die, not by the dozens, but by the hundreds. Vorath watched his tactical display with growing horror as ship markers winked out across the board. Red lights turning dark, one after another after another. His officers were shouting reports that blurred together into a single stream of disaster. Shields failing on the left flank, engines destroyed on 3 carriers, a battlecruiser split in half by internal explosions, a destroyer group overwhelmed by drones. "What are these things?" Vorath shouted, slamming his fist against the display. "They are tiny, they are primitive. They should not be able to damage our ships." "There are too many of them," Kirith replied, and for the first time in her career, Vorath heard something in her voice that sounded like fear. "Our point defense systems cannot track them all. For every 100 we destroy, 1,000 more take their place. They are not sophisticated, Grand Admiral. They are relentless." And then, in the middle of the chaos, something happened that changed everything. Captain Reo Tanaka was still alive. His ship, the Iron Wake, was barely functional. Hull breached in 7 places, half the crew dead, engines running at 30%. By every reasonable measure, he should have withdrawn. He should have limped away and counted himself lucky to be breathing. But Tanaka was not feeling reasonable. He had watched 216 ships die around him. He had listened to the final transmissions of friends and colleagues as their vessels were torn apart. And now, through the smoke and sparks of his ruined bridge, he could see the Throne of Silence, Vorath's massive command carrier, 12 kilometers of armored metal bristling with weapons, the brain and heart of the entire Cathari fleet. "Helm," he said calmly, "set a collision course for the enemy flagship. Maximum acceleration." His helmsman turned and stared at him. "Captain, we cannot survive a ram against a ship that size. We will not even scratch it." I know, Tanaka said. We are not going to ram it. We are going to get close, and then we are going to detonate every piece of munitions we have left, every missile, every warhead, every fuel cell, all of it, at once. The bridge was silent for a moment. Then his weapons officer, a young woman named Lieutenant Sahar, spoke up. The explosion will not penetrate their main armor, Captain, but if we detonate at the right position, we can destroy their external sensor array and their primary communications hub. We can blind them and silence them. Tanaka smiled, a tired, sad, fierce smile. That is exactly what I had in mind. The Iron Wake surged forward on its dying engines, racing toward the Throne of Silence like a burning arrow. Cathari point defense guns fired at it, but in the chaos of the drone swarms, the small destroyer was just one more piece of debris in a sky full of destruction. On the Throne of Silence, Kirith spotted the incoming ship. One damaged destroyer on a collision course, she reported. Minimal threat. She was wrong. The Iron Wake reached its detonation point, less than a kilometer from the Throne's communications tower. And Captain Tanaka gave his last order. All hands, brace. It has been an honor. Detonate. The explosion was blinding. Every warhead, every fuel reserve, every piece of ordnance aboard the Iron Wake erupted simultaneously in a ball of fire and metal that engulfed the upper section of the Throne of Silence. The blast did not penetrate the main hull. Tanaka had known it would not. But it shredded the sensor arrays, melted the communications dishes, and tore the external antenna network to pieces. The Throne of Silence went blind. The Throne of Silence went mute. For 11 critical minutes, Grand Admiral Vorath could not see his fleet, and his fleet could not hear him. The command carrier that coordinated 9,700 ships was suddenly a deaf and sightless giant drifting in the dark. And the Cathari fleet, trained for 12,000 years to follow orders from above rather than think for themselves, fell into chaos. Individual captains issued contradictory commands. Some ships advanced, while others retreated. Formations broke apart as vessels collided or fired on empty space. The precise, mechanical discipline that was the Cathari's greatest strength became their greatest weakness, because without someone telling them what to do, they did not know what to do. By the time Vorath's engineers restored partial sensor capability and emergency communications, the damage was catastrophic. Over 4,200 ships were gone, destroyed by drones, crushed by lunar rock, disabled by EMPs, or torn apart in the confusion of those terrible 11 minutes. Vorath stared at the number on his display and could not process it. He had brought 9,700 ships to destroy a primitive world. He had lost nearly half of them. The remaining ships were damaged, demoralized, and scattered. Kirith approached him quietly. Some captains are retreating without orders, she said. Vorath said nothing. He stood motionless on his bridge, and for the first time in his long and bloody career, the most feared admiral in the galaxy felt something cold and unfamiliar crawling up his spine. He did not yet have a name for it, but the humans would have recognized it instantly. They called it fear. Director Lena Vasquez watched the tactical display in the bunker beneath the Rocky Mountains and saw something she had never expected to see. The Cathari fleet was breaking apart. Ships were drifting without formation, some retreating, some spinning dead in space, and the great organized wall of 9,700 warships was now a scattered mess of burning metal and confusion. She had lost so much to reach this moment. 216 ships in the first battle, thousands of drones expended, every orbital satellite destroyed, nuclear weapons detonated in her own sky, and brave Captain Tanaka and the crew of the Iron Wake gone forever. The cost was staggering, and the grief would come later. She knew it would hit her like a hammer when this was over. But right now, in this moment, she saw something incredible. She saw the enemy bleeding, and she made a decision that shocked every officer in the room. "All remaining ships, advance," she ordered. "Every armed vessel on Earth, in orbit, on the moon, everything that can fly and shoot, we are not defending anymore. We are hunting." General Morrison stepped forward. "Director, we have 84 warships remaining, most of them damaged. You want us to attack a force that still outnumbers us by thousands?" "I want us to finish what we started," Vasquez replied, and her voice was made of iron. "They are confused, scattered, and afraid. They have never experienced this. If we give them time to regroup, they will regain their discipline and their numbers will crush us. But if we hit them now, while they are broken, we can shatter them completely." She looked around the room. "This is not a military decision. This is a survival decision. We do not get a second chance." Morrison held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "All ships, advance. Weapons free." What happened next was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. Earth's 84 surviving warships surged forward, their engines burning at maximum, their weapons hot and ready. But they were not alone. Behind them came a fleet that no military planner could have predicted. Armed civilian transports, retrofitted cargo haulers, mining ships with drilling lasers repurposed as weapons, private yachts carrying homemade missile racks, and even a luxury cruise shuttle, with its observation windows removed and replaced with jury-rigged railgun turrets. It was not a navy. It was a mob, a furious, desperate, impossible mob of every ship that could fly, and every human who refused to sit on the ground and wait to die. Commander Priya Okonkwo led the civilian contingent from the bridge of a converted cargo ship called the Red Hammer. Its hold was packed with mining explosives. Its navigation computer was held together with electrical tape. And its crew was made up of miners, engineers, and retired pilots who had volunteered within hours of the first attack. She broadcast on all frequencies, and her voice carried across the void to every human ship and every Cathari vessel. "You came to our home. You killed our people. Now learn what that costs." The human fleet, military and civilian together, crashed into the scattered Cathari formation like a wave of fire. The Cathari had protocols for every kind of warfare. They had studied 1,000 species and cataloged every battle tactic in the galaxy. But they had no protocol for this. They had no strategy for an enemy that attacked after being defeated. They had no response for civilian ships charging into battle alongside warships. They had no psychological model for a species that became more dangerous as it lost more. Every species the Cathari had ever fought followed the same pattern. When they were losing, they surrendered. When they were outmatched, they fled. When the situation became hopeless, they accepted their fate. That was how intelligent beings behaved. They calculated the odds, saw the futility, and stopped fighting. Humans did not do this. Humans did the opposite. The worse things got, the harder they fought. The more they lost, the angrier they became. And when they were backed into a corner with nothing left to lose, they became something that the Cathari had no word for in their language. On the ground, every nation on Earth turned its weapons skyward. Ground-based railguns designed for orbital construction fired tungsten slugs at enemy ships with devastating accuracy. The asteroid deflection laser array in the Sahara Desert, built to protect Earth from space rocks, now burned holes through Cathari hull plating at the speed of light. A repurposed particle accelerator in Switzerland sent beams of charged particles screaming into orbit, overloading alien shield generators. The Cathari were being attacked from every direction, from the human ships above and from the planet below. And in the chaos, individual acts of impossible bravery were happening everywhere. A retired cargo pilot named Dmitry Volkov, 62 years old, with bad knees and worse eyesight, flew his ancient transport ship directly into the open hangar bay of a Cathari battlecruiser. He had loaded every available space in his ship with fuel canisters and industrial explosives. When his ship crashed into the hangar deck and detonated, the explosion ripped through the battlecruiser from the inside, splitting it in half and sending debris cascading into 2 escort ships nearby, destroying all 3. A squadron of 6 mining ships targeted a Cathari carrier that had lost its shields to EMP damage. The miners used their drilling lasers, tools designed to cut through asteroid rock, to bore into the carrier's hull at multiple points simultaneously. The carrier's armor, designed to resist energy weapons and missiles, had never been tested against sustained precision cutting. The lasers broke through in 4 places, and the miners pumped their remaining explosives into the breaches. The carrier blew apart from within. A teenage pilot named Yuki Hayashi, who had stolen her father's private shuttle and flown it into orbit against every regulation and direct order, managed to dock with a disabled Cathari frigate by matching its tumbling rotation. She attached magnetic charges to its engine assembly and detonated them remotely, sending the frigate spinning into a larger vessel behind it. Both ships were destroyed in the collision. On the bridge of the Throne of Silence, Grand Admiral Vorath watched his fleet die. The tactical display was a nightmare. Ship after ship vanishing, whole formations collapsing, and the human swarm pressing deeper and deeper into what remained of his armada. "They should not be able to do this," he whispered. His 4 eyes moved across the display, searching for some pattern, some logic, some vulnerability he could exploit. But there was no pattern. The humans were not fighting with strategy. They were fighting with rage and desperation, and a refusal to die that defied every model of rational behavior. "Grand Admiral," Kirith said, and her voice was raw, "we have lost 8,900 ships. Our remaining forces are in full retreat across multiple sectors. Squadron commanders are not responding to orders. Many have abandoned their ships. 8,900. When they had arrived at Earth just days ago, they had 9,700. Now they had 800, and that number was shrinking by the minute. They are not soldiers," Draith said from his station, his voice hollow with shock. "The ones attacking us now, they are civilians, cargo ships, mining vessels, private craft. They have no training, no military discipline, no combat experience, and they are winning." For a moment, his mask of cold authority cracked, and the question that came out of his mouth was not a tactical question. It was something deeper, something almost primal. "What are they?" he asked. Kirith looked at the display, at the swarm of mismatched human ships tearing through the Cathari fleet like a fire through dry wood, and she answered with words that would be remembered for a very long time. "They are what happens when you try to kill something that refuses to die." The bridge was silent. Vorath closed his 4 eyes. When he opened them, the cold authority was back, but beneath it was something new, something the Grand Admiral had never felt before. It was the understanding that he had made a terrible mistake, and that mistake was going to cost his species more than he could possibly imagine. "All ships," he said, and his voice was steady, even though his world was crumbling. "Full retreat, immediate jump to hyperspace. All ships that can still move, run." It was the first time in 12,000 years that a Cathari purge fleet had been ordered to retreat. The surviving Cathari vessels turned and fled. Those that still had functional hyperspace drives spooled up their engines and tore open holes in the fabric of space, disappearing in flashes of distorted light. Those that could not run were left behind, some surrendering, some fighting to the last, some simply drifting dead as the human mob swept over them. And on the surface of Earth, 8 billion people looked up at the sky and watched the invaders run. Of the 9,700 warships that had entered the Sol system, with the absolute certainty of victory, only 17 made it to hyperspace. 17 battered, broken, barely functional ships that limped away from Earth like wounded animals fleeing a fire, leaving behind the wreckage of the most catastrophic military defeat in galactic history. Some of those 17 did not even make it home. 3 collapsed out of hyperspace in Allied ports, their hulls cracked and their crews half dead from radiation exposure. 2 more were so badly damaged that they had to be scuttled by their own officers, their broken remains left to drift in the void between stars. But the 12 that did reach Ketheri space carried something more dangerous than weapons or soldiers. They carried a story, and that story would change the galaxy forever. On Earth, the silence after the battle was almost unbearable. For days, the guns had been firing, the sky had been burning, and the ground had been shaking. And now there was nothing but quiet. And in that quiet, the weight of what had happened began to settle on the shoulders of every human alive. The cost was enormous. Millions were dead, soldiers and civilians alike. Cities on 3 continents had been struck by stray orbital bombardment before the Kethari fleet had been thrown into chaos. The debris field in orbit was so thick that launching anything into space would be impossible for years. The moon's mining facilities were wrecked. The Mars colony was cut off from communication. And nearly every satellite humanity had ever built was gone, destroyed, or detonated in the battle. Director Vasquez walked through the corridors of the mountain bunker and felt every loss like a physical wound. She had ordered those ships forward. She had sent Captain Tanaka and the Iron Wake to their deaths. She had approved the use of nuclear weapons in Earth's own orbit. Every terrible decision had been hers, and she would carry that weight for the rest of her life. But humanity was alive. Battered, bleeding, grieving, but alive. 3 days after the last Kethari ship fled the Sol system, Vasquez stood before the United Nations General Assembly in a broadcast that was watched by every human being on Earth, on the Moon, and on Mars. She wore her uniform, stained and singed from the days spent in the bunker. A white bandage was wrapped across her temple, where a falling ceiling panel had cut her during one of the orbital strikes. She looked exhausted and old and unbreakable. 3 days ago, 9,700 alien warships entered our solar system, she began. They came with a fleet larger than anything we could match, armed with weapons we had never seen, backed by an empire that has been destroying civilizations for 12,000 years. She paused and looked out at the assembly. Hundreds of faces from every nation, every culture, every corner of a wounded world. 17 of those ships went home. 17 out of 9,700. Let that number echo across every star in this galaxy. Her voice grew stronger. We did not ask for this war. We did not seek it. We did not want it. But when it came to our door, we answered. Every soldier who flew into that first hopeless battle. Every civilian who strapped weapons to a cargo ship. Every submarine crew that launched nuclear fire into our own sky. Every person on this planet who refused to kneel. They answered. She leaned forward, and her eyes burned with something that was not anger and was not joy, but was something fiercer than both. And if anyone else out there is watching, if any other empire, collective, or dominion is thinking about what they saw today, know this. Earth is not a world you schedule for removal. Earth is the world that removes you. The assembly erupted. The sound carried through the broadcast to every screen, every speaker, every device on the planet. It was not applause. It was a roar, raw and primal, the sound of a species that had looked extinction in the face and spit in its eye. Across the galaxy, the news spread faster than light itself. The Kethari Collective, the most feared military power in known space, the empire that had crushed 400 species and ruled unchallenged for millennia, had sent nearly 10,000 warships to destroy a single pre-FTL planet, and fewer than 20 had come back. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session. Representatives from hundreds of species gathered in the Great Chamber on the neutral world of Thessic, and for the first time in living memory, the Cathari delegation sat in silence. They had no defense, no explanation, no way to spin a defeat so total and so humiliating. Species that had lived under Cathari threat for centuries suddenly found their courage. Rebellion sparked in occupied systems. Vassal states refused tribute payments. Military alliances that had been unthinkable a week ago were now being negotiated in open session. The Cathari had ruled through fear, and that fear was gone, shattered by a species that most of the galaxy had never even heard of. And then the messages to Earth began. Not threats, not demands, but cautious greetings from civilizations that wanted to know more about the people who had done the impossible. One message came from the ancient and reclusive Sithari remnant, a species so old that they remembered the galaxy before the Cathari rose to power. Their message was brief, and carried the weight of 10,000 years of watching and waiting. We have seen 10,000 species rise and fall. None have fought as you have. We would like to talk. Meanwhile, in a cold chamber deep within the Cathari homeworld, Grand Admiral Vorath Zane stood before the High Command and delivered his final report. He was stripped of his rank, his decorations removed, his name entered into the rolls of failure, a fate worse than death in Cathari culture. He was expected to beg, to excuse, to blame. Instead, he stood straight and spoke with the same cold clarity he had carried his entire career. "We made a mistake," he said. "Not a tactical mistake, not a strategic mistake, a conceptual one. We assumed humans were like every other species, that they would calculate the odds, see the futility, and accept their end. But humans do not calculate like we do. They do not weigh survival against probability. They weigh survival against everything they love. And when you threaten what a human loves, mathematics no longer applies." The High Command listened in silence. "We sent 9,700 ships because we believed in overwhelming force," Vorath continued. "But overwhelming force only works against an enemy that can be overwhelmed. The humans could not be overwhelmed. Every loss made them angrier. Every death made them more determined. Every advantage we held, they found a way to neutralize, not through superior technology, but through a willingness to sacrifice that we have never encountered in any species, anywhere, in 12,000 years." He straightened his back one final time. "If you send another fleet, it will fail. If you send a larger fleet, it will fail worse. You cannot defeat them by killing them, because killing them only makes the survivors fight harder. The humans are not a species you can purge. They are a species you must learn to live beside, or they will be a species that ends you." The High Command ordered his execution. It was carried out within the hour. But his words were recorded, and within days they were classified as mandatory reading for every Cathari military commander. The report was titled simply, "On the Nature of Humans," and it became the most studied document in Cathari history. 5 years passed. Earth rebuilt, not just what it had lost, but far beyond. The wreckage of thousands of Cathari warships provided a treasure trove of alien technology, faster-than-light drives, advanced energy systems, shield generators, sensor arrays, and weapons that humanity reverse-engineered with the same terrifying speed that had alarmed the Cathari in the first place. The United Earth Defense Directorate was reorganized into the United Earth Federation, with Vasquez as its first Secretary General. The nations of Earth, united by the shared trauma of near extinction, put aside their old rivalries and turned their collective energy toward a single goal. Never again would humanity be caught unprepared. And then came the day that changed everything a second time. In the orbital shipyard above Earth, built in the cleared debris field that had once been a graveyard of alien metal, humanity's first interstellar warship slid out of its construction cradle and into the light of the sun. It was called the UES Remember, and it was a masterpiece of human ingenuity and alien technology, A ship that could cross the galaxy at speeds the Cathari would find alarming. On its bridge, a young officer named Lieutenant Mika Tanaka, daughter of Captain Reo Tanaka, pinned a small memorial patch to her uniform. It bore the silhouette of a destroyer, and 2 words, Iron Wake. She touched it once, gently, and then took her station. Secretary General Vasquez watched the launch from her office window. The Remember rose from the shipyard, its engines glowing with captured alien light, and accelerated toward the edge of the solar system. She watched it until it was nothing but a bright point against the stars, and then she allowed herself a rare smile. The Remember reached the jump point, spooled its FTL drive, and vanished in a flash of bent light. Humanity was no longer confined to 1 star. The species that had been scheduled for removal was now walking among the stars, and it was carrying with it a reputation that no amount of diplomacy or time could erase. Across the galaxy, in throne rooms and war chambers and council halls, a new phrase had entered the vocabulary of 1,000 alien languages. Most of these species had never needed such a phrase before, because the concept it described had never existed in their experience. But now it did, written in the fire and blood of 9,683 destroyed warships, and it would not be forgotten. The phrase was simple, and it was this: Do not provoke the humans.